This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
I want to turn to 16-year-old Swedish climate activist Greta Thunberg, who joined Extinction Rebellion protesters last month in London.
Now facing an existential crisis, the climate crisis and ecological crisis, which have never been treated as crises before. They have been ignored for decades. And for way too long, the politicians and the people in power have gotten away with not doing anything at all to fight the climate crisis and the ecological crisis. But we will make sure that they will not get away with it any longer.
So still with us, Georg Monbiot, British journalist and author. He's a columnist with The Guardian. So Georg Monbiot, can you respond? Tell us the significance of these school strikes that Greta launched, their possible influence on the British Parliament's vote, and also what you've said about the media coverage of climate change and how that's affected public perceptions of this crisis.
Yeah. Well, the school strikes alongside Extinction Rebellion have changed everything in this country and indeed in many other parts of the world. They have suddenly galvanized public opinion and public action, and they have forced the media to cover this issue, which is it has massively neglected for many years. I mean, for 30-odd years I've been banging my head against a wall saying, look, these are the issues that count. Climate breakdown, environmental breakdown are far more important than the economy. The economy, like everything else, cannot survive without our life support systems. And yet, if they're covered at all, they're relegated to a tiny footnote. There was a recent survey done by Deloitte of the major broadcasters in the UK, and they found that the word pizza was mentioned 10 times as often as climate change last year, and chocolate was mentioned 30 times as often, which gives you some idea of our priorities in this country.
Well, you wrote an article, George, in December about how U.S. billionaires are fueling extreme right-wing causes in the UK. Do those causes include climate change? And what is the nature of this influence?
So we have now this shift of the Koch brothers and others operating not just in the US but elsewhere. They've been funding in this country a magazine called Spiked, which has a long record of dismissing the environmental crisis, dismissing the climate crisis, attacking campaigners, including Greta Thunberg, with this vicious, horrible attack, basically attacking her for being autistic, for having Asperger's, and in the most disgusting way. And it doesn't make sense until you realise, oh yes, they're funded by the Koch brothers. And, you know, for a long time, obviously, billionaires have been controlling the media in one way or another. In most cases, you have to be a billionaire to own a newspaper or television station, and what billionaires want is the opposite to what most of the world needs. But now we see them infiltrating organizations they don't necessarily own, but funding them and ensuring that their agenda is followed.
Georg Monbiot, and actually people should go to Greta's conversation that we had with her in Poland at the UN Climate Summit, where she talks about Asperger's, having it, and how it makes her single-focused and seeing things in black and white. Really interesting. People should go to democracynow.org. But in this last minute we have, if you can talk about the broader effects of the parliamentary announcement, what it means around the world. I mean, you have the situation, for example, where the effects of climate change are already being felt, particularly in the global south. Indonesia has announced it plans to relocate its capital away from Jakarta, home to 10 million people, as the city is threatened by a 1-2 punch of subsiding land and rising seas due to climate change. In this last minute, talk about that and what this means for the world.
Yes. Well, for so long, the rich world has benefited from the burning of fossil fuels while the poor world is having to pay the price. And we're now seeing this come home to roost. So all rich nations need to declare a climate emergency and then act on that by leaving fossil fuels in the ground, by retiring fossil fuel-dependent infrastructure, and by completely changing the basis of their economies.
Well, we want to thank you so much for being with us. George Monbiot, British journalist and author, columnist with The Guardian, most recent book, Out of the Wreckage, A New Politics for an Age of Crisis. We'll link to your piece in The Guardian, Only Rebellion Will Prevent an Ecological Apocalypse.